Over 1 billion people worldwide drink coffee every single day, consuming a total of almost 10 million tons of coffee beans throughout 2021. Starbucks Corporation has dominated the industry for decades, capturing $30 billion through a network of 34,000 global stores. But in 2017, when Howard Schultz finally stepped away from the company after 35 years, his replacement did the easiest yet most dangerous thing a CEO could do to increase a stagnant stock price. And very conveniently, his compensation plan was changed just before he did it to maximize his personal gain. So today, we're going to investigate whether the Starbucks CEO cheated investors out of millions of dollars. Starbucks has a long history dating back to the early 1970s. The first store was opened in Seattle, Washington by its founders Jerry Baldwin, Zev Siegel, and Gordon Bowker. And this 1971 version of Starbucks would be completely unrecognizable to most customers today. For starters, they didn't even sell coffee drinks, which you might say is a fairly important component of the business today. The first few stores just sold bags of coffee beans, purchasing coffee beans from Peet's Coffee and Tea, a bean supply that the founders would later acquire in 1984. But before that, Starbucks underwent its first major transformation. Enter Howard Schultz. Howard Schultz is one of the most successful American businessmen of all time, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. Schultz began working at Starbucks in 1982 as a director of retail operations and marketing, and he probably made the most important contribution to Starbucks in its history. One day, he sat down with the founders of the Starbucks and said, drop the, just Starbucks.
Just Facebook.
Wait, no, wrong story. He sat down with the founders and said, you should try selling espresso beverages. So they did. The first store where they tried selling espresso beverages was a success, but the original founders had no interest in pursuing a cafe chain, so Schultz went out on his own to build his own coffee shop vision. Eventually, about 2 years later, the original Starbucks founders decided to focus on Peet's Coffee and Tea, so they sold the retail unit of Starbucks to Schultz, also allowing him to rebrand his own stores to the Starbucks brand. Schultz has remained at the head of the company for most of its history. He was CEO from 1988 to 2000, and by then the company had 3,501 stores, mostly in North America, and was producing about $2.2 billion of revenue. At that time, Schultz moved to a new chief global strategist position to lead the company in its international expansion, but this ended up being the toughest period for the company. Starbucks was growing its revenue, but it was doing it almost entirely through the expansion of stores rather than the improvement of revenue at existing stores. And the key reason for this, particularly in their North American business, was due to increased competition from a number of major competitors, including McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts. The result was a stock price that fell over 75% beginning in 2006 and ending during the global financial crisis. Schultz took back the CEO position and began turning the company around again. From 2008 to 2015, revenue doubled to $19 billion from a store network of over 23,000. But Schultz was starting to get tired. He'd been at the helm of a company for almost 35 years, or at least the better part of the past 35 years, and he had other aspirations, like beating the other rich businessman running for the US presidency. So in 2015, he set in motion a plan to step away from the company. And this is where we introduce the main character of today's story, Kevin Johnson, who is the current CEO of Starbucks. Kevin Johnson was hired by Starbucks in 2015 as Chief Operating Officer and President. Shortly after being brought on to Starbucks, Howard Schultz released a 5-year plan for the business. The plan included the ambitious goals of adding 12,000 new stores, including 5,000 in China, mid-single-digit same-store sales growth, 10% per year revenue growth, and 15 to 20% per year growth in earnings per share, all over the period from 2017 to 2021. So it's fair to say in 2017, when Howard Schultz stepped back and became executive chairman and Kevin Johnson took over as CEO, he certainly had his hands full. But there's actually one other goal that I left out that is going to form the main part of today's video, which is that they wanted to return $15 billion to shareholders in the form of dividends and share repurchases. For those who don't know, dividends are cash payments directly made to shareholders, and share buybacks or share repurchases mean the company is rebuying shares from investors and deleting those shares, essentially increasing the value of each share. $15 billion over the course of a 5-year period would be about $3 billion each year, and at the time, Starbucks was producing about $2.7 to $2.8 billion per year in profit, profit. So if Starbucks was going to achieve this, they would need to either increase their profits over time over that 5-year period and or take on some debt to supplement the profits that the business is producing so that they can deliver more to shareholders than the company actually produced. But all in all, it was an achievable goal. Ambitious, but definitely achievable given the significant opportunity Starbucks still had to expand across Asia. But no, that was not enough for Mr. Kevin Johnson. So in 2017, he increased the pledge to $25 billion and reduced the time horizon by 1 year to the end of 2020. And that is how you turn an ambitious but achievable goal into something that is completely unachievable without the use of massive amounts of debt. So in other words, the underlying business, the profit that the business actually produces from selling coffee, would not be able to deliver that much cash to shareholders, especially because they probably want to use a good portion of their profit to continue expanding their store network and achieve those 12,000 stores that they're aiming for over the next 5 years. In mid-2018, Howard Schultz stepped away from the board of directors entirely, leaving Starbucks behind, and around that time, Johnson made his first big move, signing a $7 billion cash licensing deal with Nestle, giving them the right to use Starbucks' brands in their products. The deal was brilliant because Starbucks had no intention of competing with Nestle for their in-store products, and this way they were able to generate an upfront cash payment essentially from Nestle that they could immediately put into share repurchases and start chipping away at that $25 billion pledge. And by the end of 2017 and 2018, Starbucks had returned a total of $12.1 billion to shareholders. But with 2 years down and only 2 years to go, where was the other $13 billion going to come from, especially since the massive once-in-a-lifetime deal with Nestle had already been done? Well, Johnson simply loaded the company up year after year with massive amounts of debt. In total, Starbucks racked up over $14 billion in debt, but Johnson was also making some pretty sneaky moves behind the scenes. Top-level executives at public companies earn compensation based on the plan laid out in the annual proxy filing. And typically, this compensation is earned through a combination of ways, such as cash salary, annual bonuses, long-term incentives, and other things. In Starbucks' case, executives mostly made money through a long-term incentive plan. Without boring you with the specifics, the long-term incentive plan essentially meant how much compensation Johnson earned was tied directly to two things. One, how much profit the company produced per share, earnings per share, and two, how efficiently the company invested, and that's measured by the return on invested capital. And this is how compensation had been paid out to executives, including the CEO, for a really long time. But immediately after Howard Schultz left the company entirely, 1 or 2 small changes were made to the executive plan, and these were small but significant changes. The first was that the long-term incentive plan was no longer influenced by return on invested capital, which, as I mentioned, measures management's effectiveness or their efficiency at investing within the business, and a relative TRS multiplier was added to the compensation. And even though these are small changes, the combination of those changes is absolutely deadly, because what it means is, on one hand, Johnson can do massive amounts of share repurchases, maybe using debt, for example, and drive the stock price up, therefore increasing his compensation. And because the ROIC, the efficiency modifier, has been removed, it doesn't matter how poorly he runs the business while he does this. Between 2018 and 2019, Johnson racked up over $7 billion of debt and then turned around to use it for $9.8 billion of share repurchases in 2019. And the result of that was Johnson's compensation increased by 43%, while the company's operating profit did not increase. By 2020, he had achieved his goal of returning $25 billion to shareholders. He did about $19 billion in buybacks or share repurchases and about $5 billion in dividends. But it's not all negative, and to be completely fair, Starbucks shareholders so far have benefited greatly from the moves that Johnson has made. The value of Starbucks business has increased by almost $50 billion during Johnson's leadership, meaning the 19-odd billion spent on share repurchases has driven shareholder wealth of almost twice that amount. So if this is the case, then how has Johnson cheated investors out of millions? So far, it sounds like he's made them billions. A company like Starbucks, which is well established and and mature, yet still capitalizing on growth opportunities, is expected to deliver capital to shareholders while also protecting the economic fortress that it has built over the past few decades. And when it comes to share buybacks, they can be an effective way of delivering significant wealth to shareholders, but it is dependent over the long term on how the underlying profits of the business change, whether they stay the same, decline, or grow. Here's how. After the $19 billion was spent on share repurchases between 2017 and 2020, about 305 million shares were removed from the pool of shares that make up Starbucks' business. If we then take financial year 2021 profits for the business of $4.2 billion, and we imagine what would that look like per share before the buybacks, then it would have been about $2.80 per share of profit for shareholders. Now, after spending $15.80 per share on buybacks, that per share profit for the same year, because there's less shares, less pieces that the pie is cut up into, that per share amount is now $3.50, meaning that the share repurchases, the amount of shares that were removed from the pool, essentially provided 70 cents per year in additional profit for remaining shareholders. That means shareholders essentially paid $15.80 per share for the privilege of 70 cents in extra profit per year. All of this is to say that in the short term, immediately while share buybacks are being done, it often drives up the stock price, but in order for that higher stock price to be sustainable over time, the company needs to continue to grow its profits. This video isn't an argument for why Starbucks is failing and will fall over, or even that the buyback program is going to be a mistake. All this video is trying to highlight is that there was a new CEO who came into Starbucks, did the easiest thing he knew to make shareholders happy, which is give cash back to them and make the share price go up. And before he did that, the compensation plan was changed so that his wealth would be personally maximized before he did it. But if Starbucks shareholders benefited massively, does it even really matter that he personally benefited as well? I hope this video highlights the importance of understanding executive compensation in companies that you're analyzing, because they can influence management's decisions in a significant way for better or for worse. Hit subscribe down below. It's completely free if you want to see my videos appear in your subscription box. But otherwise, have a great day. See you in the next one.